Good morning, everyone, and welcome to CSIS. I'm Jennifer Cook. I direct the Africa program here. I'm delighted to welcome you all to CSIS, and I want to thank the panel for joining this discussion. We hope this will be interactive, debate and discussion, looking at some of the policy issues and policy dilemmas and policy priorities as the President travels to Ethiopia and Kenya next week. His fourth trip as President to Africa, one that has generated a lot of expectations in the countries he's traveling to, and one that I think kind of highlights some of the challenges and kind of dilemmas within U.S. policy towards these countries, each of which are important security partners to the United States, each of which have seen fairly strong positive economic growth and investments in infrastructure, trade, and pretty strong growth rates, although not without limits and not without some controversies, each of which has been important partners historically, and each of which is facing, in certain cases, a rollback of civil liberties, some concern over media restrictions, limits on civil society, counter-terror laws that have been overly, kind of fairly broadly interpreted. And so they bring to light, I think, the various strands of U.S. policy and how the White House and the President will kind of weigh these different policies, the one against the other, and how he conveys that. We have here today a great panel who have spent a lot of time looking at the region as a whole, also looking at the levers of U.S. policy and the internal policy dynamics at work within the U.S. administration, Congress, business community, and so forth. So we're going to have each say a few words about kind of the priority topics as they lessons for the President as he travels, kind of what they see as the important priorities on the trip, as well as analysis on the countries to which he's traveling. We're going to start with Mark Bellamy, Ambassador Mark Bellamy, who is Warburg Professor of International Relations at Simmons College in Boston. He's a senior advisor to the Africa program here, and he's former ambassador to Kenya with a long career in the Foreign Service, serving in a number of African posts. So thank you, and we'll turn then to Terrence Lyons, who is Associate Professor of Conflict Resolution at George Mason University, long-term focus on political development, transnational politics, democracy and governance. Terrence has spent a great deal of his career focusing on Ethiopia and done a lot of work with USAID, the World Bank, and others on democracy and governance issues there. We will follow up with Sarah Prey, who is Senior Policy Analyst for Africa in the Open Society Foundation's DC office. Sarah, along with OSI, works with policymakers and with a huge network of civil society groups across Africa, particularly with very strong networks in Kenya and Ethiopia to some extent, although I'm sure she'll talk about the challenges of that. We then have E.J. Hugendorn, who is with the International Crisis Groups Africa. He's the Africa Deputy Director. Previously, Horn of Africa Project Director with International Crisis Group. I'm sure you're all familiar with Crisis Group, which does just terrific analysis. They have a big network on the ground, focusing on issues of security, conflict, peacemaking, and counterterrorism. We've asked each to speak fairly briefly because we do want to open up for discussion and debate. We're going to start with Ambassador Bellamy and go down the line. So, Ambassador Bellamy.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. It's great to see this big crowd here today. There are different angles for viewing the President's trip to East Africa. There are a lot of issues that he could talk about at both stops, global issues, regional issues, bilateral issues. I'm going to focus my remarks today on the bilateral aspects of our relationship with Kenya, why that relationship has historically been very important, how it has come under quite a bit of strain in recent years, and what few themes are probably important in the context of a reset of bilateral relations, if that's an objective during the president's visit. I probably don't need to belabor the point with this audience that the bilateral relationship with Kenya, the U.S.-Kenya relationship, has been historically a pretty important one for the United States in Africa. Just a few facts on random sort of illustrate the breadth of that relationship, the fact that for many years our embassy in Nairobi was our largest in sub-Saharan Africa. I don't think that's still the case, but for quite a while the embassy was the largest. Our largest aid program in Africa for a number of years over the past decade was in Kenya. At one point I think it was the 5th largest aid program globally for the United States. Our largest CDC presence any place in the world is in Kenya. We probably get more African students from Kenya than from any other African country, both university and graduate students, which illustrates the depth of the people-to-people relationships. Our intelligence and security relationships with Kenya are long-standing. They go back a long way. I was thinking yesterday, I don't think we've actually ever had to interrupt our security assistance flows to Kenya, except I can remember one time I can remember was when the Kenyan government rather commendably held out against U.S. pressure to exempt U.S. service members from the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. And they were sanctioned under U.S. law for that principled position, which is more than a little ironic given the current circumstances in Kenya. This is a deep historical relationship. During the Cold War, Daniel Arap Moi was considered an ally of the United States, and he was rewarded accordingly. In the post-Cold War period, Kenya emerged as almost an island of stability in a very turbulent Horn of Africa region, and Kenya served as a hub for the United States and for other international actors as we put together interventions and programs to deal with conflict and humanitarian crises in places like South Sudan, Somalia, and Ethiopia. And after the 1998 bombing of our embassy in Kenya, Kenya became a very important partner of the United States in the fight against global terror, specifically the fight against Al-Qaeda in East Africa. Finally, one point that I think is important to underline, in that the United States has a fairly commendable record, I believe, of protection of human rights and supporting democratization in Kenya, particularly in the 1990s. There are many Kenyans today who remember, some of them gratefully, some of them nervously, perhaps, that the United States funded and advised and encouraged civil society organizations who were campaigning for multipartyism in Kenya, who were campaigning for greater democratic governance. And so that is a part, it's an important part, I think, of our legacy in the bilateral relationship. So there's a long history there. It has come under strain in recent years, and I think this can mostly be traced to the period just before, during, and after the 2013 presidential elections in Kenya. Many of you will recall that both candidate Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto were indicted by the ICC. They stood for the presidency. They stood for office despite those indictments, and they rallied their respective ethnic constituencies around the idea that these ICC cases were in fact sinister plots, sinister neo-colonial plots, meant to subjugate and humiliate Kenya, that Kenyans who continued to call for accountability before the ICC were in fact traitors. After the election, after President Kenyatta and William Ruto were successfully elected, the continuation of these ICC cases was made made a litmus test, both of loyalty, or how one lined up vis-a-vis the ICC. It was made a litmus test of one's loyalty and patriotism at home, and a litmus test of Kenya's relationships abroad. It was no accident that the first big foreign visit of newly elected Uhuru Kenyatta was to China, not to the UK or to the US. So in this somewhat poisonous post-election atmosphere, opposition groups, the media, civil society were all targeted to some degree, sometimes violently. Vitriol flowed from Nairobi in the direction of Washington. It included charges that the United States was funding NGOs with the aim of undermining the Kenyatta administration, or even with the aim of regime change in Kenya. This was an historic low point in our relation, 2013, 2014. Now, tensions and strains have eased somewhat recently, in part because the ICC case against President Kenyatta has been dropped. Also in part, I believe, because the Kenyans judged that their aggressive campaign has been somewhat successful, both in terms of cowing domestic opponents and in silencing or making more circumspect their international critics. When President Obama visits Kenya, obviously he's going to be aware of these recent sensitivities. That doesn't mean that he has to bow to them, but an awareness of these sensitivities is important as you go about resetting the bilateral relationship. And I would just point to, I think, three important themes that need to be looked at in the context of any resetting of U.S.-Kenyan relations. And the first of these is pretty obvious, which is to celebrate the big economic and development success story in Kenya today. The Entrepreneurship Summit in Nairobi will, of course, be a centerpiece of that. If anyone is interested in gaining a sense of the mood of confidence and optimism in Kenya today, economically, I highly suggest you go back and read President Kenyatta's State of the Union message from last March, which is a real tour de force, political barnstorming, and in many respects actually accurately reflecting the big strides that Kenya has made over the past decade. Things such as a rebasing of the economy and sustained 6% growth rates that have actually lifted Kenya into the rank of low and middle income countries. Major new resource discoveries, big infrastructure projects underway around Kenya, road and rail networks, large increases in energy production, continuing increases in broadband connectivity, rising, a more visible and middle class in Kenya today, and investors and creditors banging on the door, looking for opportunities to get involved in Kenya's growth story. You can sense the confidence in Nairobi, almost a sense of swagger and bravado on the part of Kenyan elites, a sense that maybe Kenya, for the first time since independence, really does have its destiny in its own hands, does have options as a nation that it did not have before, and does have options in terms of who it chooses to partner with internationally. And that will be, I think, what President Obama encounters in Nairobi, and it makes great sense to celebrate the success story and to look for ways to reinforce it and to connect with Kenya's success story. Now, just a couple of quick caveats. It's far from clear that this boom is completely sustainable. Some of these resource discoveries are going to be pretty slow coming online if they are ever realized. In particular, a big project to run a rail and pipeline, or a road and pipeline from the Lamu, a big Lamu port into southern Sudan, is just going nowhere now, not likely to go anywhere as long as conditions in southern Sudan is the way it is, or the way the global oil prices. The real estate boom in Nairobi beginning to look like a bubble. And there's an inequality issue here as well. Not everybody is getting rich as quickly as the Nairobi elites are. And that, at some point down the line, could pose a serious perception problem for the government. If there is a perception that this boom is disproportionately favoring one community or another, that could be a formula for serious political backlash. Second theme, I think important, and another obvious one, are Kenya's security challenges that Kenya is facing. And this is a high priority both for Kenya and for the United States. The reality in Kenya is extremely serious, and it is one that the Kenyan government is not currently in a position to adequately deal with. I think the Kenyans will expect, hope for sympathy and support from President Obama. They may also hope for increased intelligence sharing, more equipment, more training, and all of that will be fairly easy for us to supply, and I suspect we will be tempted to do so and to respond positively. It's very much in our interest that we help Kenya begin to get control of this security situation, but I'm not sure that that particular shopping list or the provision of that kind of aid is necessarily the best way to go about it. Kenya's security problems are not that it lacks allies or that it lacks training or that it lacks equipment. Kenya's security problems have to do with pervasive corruption in the security sector, with spotty leadership, lack of coordination between security agencies, and the wrong doctrines in terms of the counterinsurgency that they need to conduct against al-Shabaab. In some ways, Kenya's situation is not that different than Nigeria's vis-a-vis Boko Haram. What Kenya needs above all else is thoroughgoing security sector reform. And hopefully there may be a way that President Obama can connect our security governance initiative to this imperative of security sector reform in order to push Kenya in the right direction and enable the assistance we give them to be more effectively used. If we don't do that, I fear that we will simply be doing what is easiest for us to do, but not what addresses Kenya's fundamental security problems, in fact, which may exacerbate their problems. Finally, third theme I want to stress is that the President is going to have to address human rights and governance issues in Kenya and in Ethiopia as well. This doesn't have to be done in an in-your-face manner, but it can't be sidestepped, which I think his Kenyan hosts would prefer be the case. One big set of problems has to do with the reaction to the al-Shabaab menace in Kenya. And this reaction has included extrajudicial killings, collective punishment of entire communities, roundups and shakedowns of thousands of ordinary citizens, most of them of Somali origin, restrictions on media coverage of terrorist events, and wide-ranging crackdowns on NGOs that are vaguely suspected of contributing to radicalization or somehow delegitimizing the state. I don't have any doubt that some of those who have disappeared probably were al-Shabaab sympathizers and recruiters, and some of the NGOs that may have been delisted or targeted perhaps were providing some form of assistance to the insurgency in Kenya. But this broad-ranging crackdown has done very little to actually slow al-Shabaab's progress in Kenya. And what it has done instead is to widen the gulf between the security forces and the communities that they need to be protecting and cooperating with. And it has probably also contributed to a recruitment of frustrated and angry young Kenyans into al-Shabaab's ranks. So it would be well for us, I think, to emphasize, the President to emphasize, that in this respect at least, Kenya's counterterrorism campaign isn't working. These crackdowns, by the way, proceed from and in some ways seem similar to the crackdowns I mentioned earlier following the 2013